The morning they came for her company, Mama Abosede Adeyemi-Cole did not shout. She sat at the head of the boardroom table she had built from nothing, the same table where she had signed her first contract 31 years ago, when she had no money for a lawyer and no family name to borrow. And she watched 8 men in expensive suits arrange themselves around her like a verdict. The room smelled of imported cologne and ambition that had not been earned. The chandelier above them was hers. The carpet beneath their polished shoes was hers. The view of Lagos stretching wide and golden through the floor-to-ceiling windows was hers. And yet something in the air said that none of it would be hers for much longer. She was 58 years old. She had built Adeyemi-Cole Logistics from a single van and a rented shed in Mushin into the largest independent transport company in West Africa. She had done it without a husband's money, without a father's connections, without a single favor she had not repaid. If you have ever worked your entire life to build something, only to watch people who never lifted a finger try to take it apart, stay with me. Because what happened in that boardroom that morning, and what happened 30 years before it, is a story about what patience truly costs, and what it is finally worth. The man speaking was her nephew, Rotimi Adeyemi-Cole. He was 34, handsome in the way that came from money rather than character, and he had spent the last 3 years positioning himself inside her company with the careful, unhurried precision of a man who believes inheritance is simply delayed ownership. He placed a folder on the table in front of her. His voice was smooth. "Auntie, the board has voted. We believe a management transition is in the company's best interest." He did not say her name. He had not said her name in a year. She had noticed. She had said nothing. She looked at the folder. She did not open it. She looked at the 8 faces around the table. Some of them she recognized. Some of them she had promoted. Some of them she had trusted with things that trust should not be wasted on. The polished wood reflected her face back at her, composed, unreadable, giving nothing away. A clock on the wall measured the silence with small, indifferent ticks. She said, "Leave the room." Rotimi's smile held. "Auntie, we should discuss." She said it again. "Leave the room." Something in her tone did not ask permission. It never had. One by one, the men gathered their folders and left. Rotimi was the last. He paused at the door. "We have the votes," he said. She did not answer. He left. The door closed with a sound that felt final. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the folder. She opened it now, alone, in the room that smelled of their cologne. The document was a shareholder petition. 46% of the company's shares, accumulated quietly over 18 months through transfers she had not tracked closely enough. Legitimate on paper, deliberate in practice. She read every page with the specific, careful attention of a woman who had spent 31 years reading documents that other people hoped she would sign without reading. When she finished, she closed the folder. She placed her hands flat on the table. Her hands were not smooth. They had never been smooth. They remembered things her face did not show. They remembered a broken-down truck on a dirt road outside Ibadan. They remembered 5 young men who smelled of oil and hunger, and something else she had not known how to name then, but knew now. They remembered a decision she had made 30 years ago that everyone who knew her had told her was foolish, that everyone who loved her had told her was dangerous, that she had made anyway, because some decisions are not made with the mind. They are made with something older and quieter, and less interested in being correct. She stood from the table. She walked to the window. Lagos spread below her, alive and indifferent and enormous. Somewhere in this city, or near it, or far from it, she did not know exactly where, were 5 men she had not spoken to in 11 months. 5 men she had last seen at different moments, in different places, each departure brief and practical, in the way of people who understand that feeling. Things takes time, and time is always short. 5 men who had started as nothing. Who had been told by the world, repeatedly and without apology, that they were nothing. And who had become, quietly, without announcement, without the kind of power that announces itself, something else entirely. She did not reach for her phone. Not yet. She had learned, 30 years ago, that some things could not be rushed. And she had learned something else. Something harder. Something that had cost her more than she had expected to pay. About what it meant to trust people the world had already decided were not worth trusting. The year she had met them, she was 28 years old, and she had nothing. That was not a figure of speech. She had nothing in the specific physical daily sense of the word. No savings, no collateral, no address that a bank would accept as permanent. One dress she kept clean by wearing a second one that was not. What she had was a contract. A single transport contract from a Lagos textile exporter who had taken a chance on her because his previous transporter had failed him twice, and she had shown up to his office without an appointment and without fear, and with a detailed breakdown of why she could do the job better, cheaper, and on time. He had given her 3 months. She had exactly enough money to rent a van for one of those months. The other 2 months were a problem she had not yet solved. She drove to a mechanic compound in Mushin on a Tuesday morning in August, when the heat came off the road in visible waves, and the air smelled of exhaust and groundnut oil, and the particular urgency of a city that does not pause for anyone's financial difficulties. She needed a van maintained. She needed it maintained cheaply. And she needed the person doing it to understand that payment would come when the contract paid, not before. The compound was not what she had expected. It was orderly, small, 4 bays, 2 lifts, a storage shed with tools arranged on the walls with the precision of someone who believed that a place for everything was a form of respect for the work itself. But what she noticed first was not the compound. It was the men. There were 5 of them. Young, the oldest perhaps 26, the youngest no more than 19. They moved around the vehicles with a focused, careful energy that she recognized immediately because it was the same energy she moved with herself, the energy of people who have no margin for error and know it. One of them, a tall young man with watchful eyes and hands that moved with quiet authority, looked up when she entered. He did not smile. He assessed. She appreciated that. His name was Chukwuemeka Obi. Everyone called him Emeka. He was the oldest of the 5, and in the specific, unspoken way of people who have survived things together, he was the one the others deferred to without any of them saying so aloud. She explained what she needed: the contract, the timeline, the payment situation. Emeka listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You want us to maintain a van we've never seen for a contract you haven't started yet for money you don't have?" She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected. "What's the contract?" she told him. He asked 2 more questions. About the route, about the cargo weight. He nodded once. He said, "We'll do it." The other 4 watched. None of them spoke. But something passed between all 5 of them. Not a word, not a gesture. An understanding. The kind that comes from having nothing yourself and recognizing it in someone else, and deciding that recognition is enough. That was the first time she understood that poverty, at its best, had a language that wealth could not speak. She did not know then what she would discover years later. She did not know anything about their histories, where they had come from, what they had survived, why 5 young men were running a mechanic compound in Mushin with no family connections and no visible support, and a level of competence that was entirely self-taught. She would learn all of that slowly, over months, over years. She would learn about Emeka's father, who had beaten ambition out of him until Emeka left at 15 and never returned. She would learn about Tunde Savage, the second oldest, whose mother had sold him to a relative as domestic labor, and who had run at 16 with nothing but the clothes he wore and a talent for engines that he had taught himself from discarded manuals. She would learn about Sola Adekunle, who spoke little but built things with his hands that worked the first time and kept working, who had been on the streets of Lagos since he was 12 after a fire took his family's house, and what remained of his family scattered to relatives who did not have space for one more. She would learn about Biodan Fashola, the youngest, who had an instinct for numbers that should have been in a university somewhere and had instead been applied to keeping the compound's accounts organized and honest, not because anyone asked him to, but because he believed that honesty in small things was the only foundation worth building on. And she would learn about Dio Coca, the quiet one, who said almost nothing but saw everything, who had spent 3 years in a mechanic shed in Kano before walking to Lagos because someone had told him the city had more vans and therefore more work. She did not know any of this on that Tuesday morning in August. What she knew was simpler. They had said yes when saying no would have been easier. The contract worked. Her van ran. She delivered on time, every time, for 3 months. And when the contract renewed, she had enough to pay Amika and the others what she owed, plus something extra for the waiting. She remembered the look on Amika's face when she placed the full amount in his hand. Not surprise, exactly. Something more complicated. The look of someone who had been told repeatedly that people like him would not be paid what they were owed, and who had just received evidence to the contrary, and who was deciding what to do with that evidence. He folded the money carefully. He said, "Same terms for the next contract." She said, "Better terms." That was the beginning. Over the following year, as her business grew, 1 van to 3, 3 to 7, a proper shed in Mushin that she rented because the compound was too small, she kept bringing work to Emeka's compound. Not out of loyalty alone. They were simply the best mechanics she had found. They diagnosed problems she had not noticed. They fixed things before they broke. They worked hours that no employment contract would have required, and charged her rates that she sometimes had to argue were too low. And slowly, in the way of things that are built without a plan because the plan would have seemed too large to believe in, they became part of something. But the city had other ideas. The trouble started on a Wednesday afternoon in March, when a group of men Abosede did not recognize appeared at the compound. They were not customers. Their shoes were too clean for customers. They spoke to Emeka for 12 minutes while the others watched from the bays, and then they left. And Emeka came to find Abosede, where she was reviewing paperwork in the small office she had set up in the shed. He closed the door. He said, "Someone wants this land." She said, "What land?" He said, "The land the compound is on. The landlord sold it 3 days ago to a development company. We have 30 days. She felt her stomach tighten. They had been here 2 years. This compound was not just work. It was the only address any of them had. She knew this without asking, because she had learned to read what was not said. She said, 30 days is time. Emeka looked at her. He said, "To do what?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at the window, at the compound outside, at Tunde under a vehicle, at Sola arranging tools with his habitual precision, at Biodan bent over his account book, at Dio watching her through the glass with those eyes that saw everything. She said, "To build something they can't take." Emeka studied her. He said, "You believe that?" She said, "I will by tomorrow." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she found when she went to verify the land sale. The development company's name appeared in the records clearly. What appeared beside it, equally clearly, was the name of a company she recognized. A logistics competitor she had been underbidding for 2 years. A company whose chairman had told her, at an industry dinner she had attended in a dress she had borrowed, that women in transport were a trend that would correct itself. This was not coincidence. This was the beginning of a pattern she would not fully understand for another decade. but whose shape she felt that afternoon with the specific, cold clarity of someone who has been told, without words, that the world has decided to arrange itself against her. She did not tell Emeka what she had found. Not that day. She drove home through Lagos traffic that moved with its usual gorgeous chaos, horns and generators, and the smell of suya from a roadside grill. And she thought about what her father had told her when she was 11 years old, and she had complained that a boy in her class had taken credit for work she had done. Her father had looked at her and said, "People take what is not protected." Then he had looked away, and she had understood that the lesson was finished. She had spent 17 years being angry at that lesson. She had spent the next 17 years understanding it. That night, she made a decision that changed everything. She found an empty warehouse on the edge of Ikeja. She negotiated a lease. She told the landlord she needed 12 months, and she would pay the first 3 up front. She did not have the money for the first 3 months. She had the money for the first month, and a contract that would pay in 45 days, and the specific, dangerous confidence of a woman who had stopped waiting for permission to believe in herself. She signed the lease on a Friday. On Monday morning, she drove to Mushin and told Emeka that she needed 5 mechanics, and she had a place for a proper workshop, and she wanted them to run it with her. Emeka looked at her for a long time. He said, "As employees." She said, "As partners." The word landed in the compound like something physical. Tunde looked up from under a vehicle. Sola stopped moving. Biodan set down his pen. Dio turned from whatever he had been watching in the street. Emeka said, "Partners in what?" She said, "In what we build next." Nobody spoke. The heat pressed down on the corrugated roof. A motorcycle somewhere outside backfired twice. Biodan was the one who finally moved. He stood up, slowly, with the careful dignity of someone who has spent years being deliberately small in spaces that required it, and he said quietly, "When do we start?" They started on a Wednesday. That was 30 years ago. The warehouse in Ikeja became Adeyemi-Cole Logistics' first proper hub. The 5 mechanics did not just maintain vehicles. They helped design the maintenance system that kept the fleet running at a reliability rate that became the company's core competitive advantage. Emeka developed a fault prediction protocol that he wrote by hand in a notebook, and that later, when the company was large enough to have engineers, those engineers digitized and called proprietary. Tunde trained mechanics the company hired, passing on knowledge he had never formally received. Sola built things, shelves, rigs, custom modifications, that reduced downtime in ways no consultant had suggested, because no consultant had spent enough time on the floor to notice the problems Sola had been noticing for years. Biodan managed the workshop accounts with an honesty that Abosede never had to verify because she could feel it in the numbers, the way honest numbers feel different from numbers that have been managed. And Dio, quiet, observant Dio, became the person every driver and every client trusted without knowing exactly why. Because he listened, because he remembered, because he never told anyone more than they needed to know, and always made sure they knew exactly what they needed to. The company grew. The 5 grew with it. Not in title. Abost had offered titles more than once, and each time been refused in different ways, with different words, but always the same essential message. We don't need what's written above a door. We need the work to be real. She understood. She stopped offering titles and started offering something harder to name and more difficult to take away. She offered them the company's truth. Every major decision, every contract negotiation, every expansion, every crisis, she brought to the room where the 5 of them were. Not to ask permission, not to perform consultation. Because she had learned in the first 3 years that these 5 men saw things she did not see, that their combined knowledge of how the company actually functioned, on the ground, in the vehicles, in the conversations that happened in the workshop before she arrived, was irreplaceable. She brought problems, and they solved them. She brought questions, and they answered them honestly, even when honesty was uncomfortable, even when the honest answer was that she had made a mistake. Especially then. That was what she missed now, standing at the window of her own boardroom with a hostile shareholder petition in a folder on the table behind her. That specific quality of being told the truth by people who had no interest in the version of the truth that would please her. She turned from the window. She picked up her phone. She did not call Emeka first. She called Biodun, because Biodun understood numbers, and what had been done to her had been done with numbers, and she needed someone who could see inside the structure of it before anything else. She let it ring. It went to voicemail. She tried Tunde. Voicemail. Sola. Nothing. Dio. One ring, then silence. She sat down in her chair, the one at the head of the table, her chair, and she looked at the room around her, and she felt for the first time in 31 years genuinely afraid. Not of losing the company, of losing it before she could explain to the 5 people who had built it with her what was happening and why, and what they might do about it. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. It was not a number she recognized. She answered anyway. A voice she knew as well as her own said, "We know." It was Emeka. She could not speak for a moment. He said, quieter, "We've known for 6 months. Biodun has been tracking the share transfers. We didn't tell you because we weren't certain. Now we are." She said, "How certain?" He said, "Certain enough to move." She said, "Emeka, what did you do?" He said, "Nothing yet. We were waiting." She said, "For what?" A pause. Then, "For you to call." Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. But something inside her chest was doing something that she was not going to examine too closely in a room full of her own furniture. She said, "Where are you?" He said, "Downstairs." She went to the window. 31 floors below, on the street in front of the building, 4 vehicles were parked in a row. Not flashy, practical, clean. 5 men stood on the pavement. One of them looked up. He did not wave. He did not smile. He simply looked up, the way someone looks when they have been keeping track of exactly which floor you are on, and they want you to know it. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. He saw it. He nodded once. That was all. That was everything. Because what they had built together, in a broken compound in Mushin, in a leased warehouse in Ikeja, in 30 years of early mornings and honest numbers and problems solved by people who were never supposed to be in the room where problems got solved, was not a company. Companies could be taken. What they had built was something else, something that lived in knowledge and trust, and the specific, patient loyalty of people who have stood together in places where standing together was not safe. And that, Abosede Adeyemi-Cole understood, as she stood at the window of her own boardroom on the worst morning of her professional life, was something that 46% of the shares could not touch. Rotimi had made a mistake. He had looked at the company and seen assets. He had never once thought to look at the people who kept those assets alive. He had walked past Emeka 100 times in 30 years and seen a mechanic. He had looked at Biodun's numbers and seen an employee. He had watched Tunde train a generation of mechanics and seen overhead. He had never once understood that what was watching him back from behind those quiet, careful faces was not deference. It was patience. The specific, practiced patience of people who had learned, very young, that the world moved on a longer clock than the one powerful men watched. She stepped back from the window. She picked up the folder from the table. She walked to the boardroom door. She opened it. Her assistant, Funmi, was at her desk in the corridor, her face carefully neutral in the way of someone who has heard things and is waiting to be told what to know. Abosede said, "Call security. Tell them to allow 5 visitors up. And tell Rotimi's people that the board meeting is postponed." Funmi said, "Postponed to when?" Abosede said, "Until I say otherwise." She walked toward the elevator. Behind her, the boardroom sat empty, the chandelier still burning over a folder that had not yet read the room correctly. Somewhere below, an elevator was rising. In it, 5 men who smelled not of imported cologne, but of engine oil and long roads and 30 years of work that had never asked to be celebrated were coming up to finish something that had started on a Tuesday morning in August when a young woman with no money and one clean dress had walked into a compound in Mushin and heard the word yes from people the world had told there was no point asking. The elevator doors opened, and what came out of them was not gratitude. It was not revenge. It was something the boardroom had never seen before. It was the truth, arriving, finally, with receipts. Emeka stepped out of the elevator first. He was 56 years old now, and he carried his age the way certain men carry long roads, not as weight, but as direction. His jacket was dark, simple, the kind that did not try to impress anything. His hands, when he reached out and took Abosede's hand in both of his, were still the hands she remembered, rough at the knuckles, certain in their grip. The hands of someone who had spent a lifetime fixing things that other people had given up on. Behind him came Tunde, broader now across the shoulders, his expression carrying the particular stillness of a man who has learned that stillness is its own kind of strength. Then Sola, who moved quietly as he always had, his eyes already scanning the corridor the way they always scanned every room. Not with suspicion, but with the habit of a person who needs to understand a space before he can work inside it. Biodan came next with a leather case under one arm, his face composed in the specific way of someone who has spent the last 6 months preparing for exactly this moment and is now focused entirely on execution. And last, Dio, who stepped out of the elevator and looked at Abosede and said nothing at all, because Dio had never needed words for the things that mattered most, and she had learned, 30 years ago, to hear him clearly anyway. She looked at all 5 of them. She said, "How bad is it?" Biodan opened the leather case. He said, "Bad enough that they thought it would work. Not bad enough that it will." She said, "Show me." They went back into the boardroom. The room that had smelled of Rotimi's cologne now smelled of something else. The faint trace of machine oil that clung to certain hands, regardless of how carefully they were washed. And something older and harder to name, the smell of people who had been working on a problem long after everyone else had gone home. Aboste sat at the head of the table. The 5 arranged themselves around her, not in the configuration of a meeting, but in the configuration of people who know each other well enough to sit wherever is useful. Biodan laid documents on the table. He said, 18 months ago, a shell company registered in Abuja began acquiring minority stakes in small logistics firms across the southwest. Nothing large enough to trigger disclosure requirements, nothing connected, on paper, to Adeyemi-Cole. The company's name changed twice in 12 months, standard practice for avoiding pattern recognition. He paused. But numbers don't change their names. The capital flow was consistent. Same source, different channels. Aboste said, Rotimi. Biodan said, Rotimi is the face. The money behind him is older. He placed a sheet on the table. This company, Broadridge Transport Ventures, has been systematically underbidding your contracts in the Northern Corridor for 8 months. Contracts you held for 11 years. Clients who left said the pricing was impossible to match. It was. They were operating at a loss. Tunde said without looking up, You don't operate at a loss to win contracts. You operate at a loss to weaken a competitor long enough to take them over. The room was quiet. Aboste looked at the documents. The numbers were meticulous. Biodan had always been meticulous. He had kept the workshop accounts in a notebook with blue ink for the first 3 years, every figure exact to the kobo, and she had once asked him why he was so precise about amounts that were small enough to round, and he had said, because the habit of rounding is how people justify larger inaccuracies later. She had thought about that sentence more times than she could count. She said, "Who is behind Broadridge?" Biodun said, "A board member." She looked up. He placed a second sheet on the table. "Emmanuel Okeke, appointed to your board 14 months ago, recommended by Rotimi, presented as an independent director." Abosede did not move. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face gave nothing away. But her jaw had tightened by exactly the amount it always tightened when she had been told something that confirmed a suspicion she had been hoping was wrong. She said, "Emmanuel Okeke recommended the Northern Corridor pricing review." Biodun said, "Yes," she said, "and the review recommended a 15% rate reduction to remain competitive." Biodun said, "Which made those contracts unprofitable at your existing operational costs. Which gave Rotimi's faction grounds to argue that the division was underperforming. Which gave them grounds to petition for management restructuring." Sola spoke for the first time. His voice was low and deliberate, the voice of someone who had built things and understood that structures fail, not from outside force, but from internal weakness that was there before the force arrived. He said, "They didn't attack the company. They created a problem inside it, and then offered to fix the problem they created." Abosede looked at him. He said, "It's the same thing they did with the compound in Mushin." She went very still. He said, "The development company that bought the land 30 years ago. I looked it up 2 years ago. The chairman of that company is Emmanuel Okeke's father." The room was completely silent. Outside, Lagos continued its enormous, indifferent life. A bus horn somewhere far below, the low, constant murmur of a city that does not stop for anyone's reckoning. But in this room, 31 floors up, something had just become visible that had been invisible for 3 decades. A thread, thin and patient, connecting a dirt compound in Mushin to a boardroom in Lagos Island, connecting a young woman with nothing to a woman with everything, connecting a Tuesday morning 30 years ago to this morning, this table, this silence. Abosede said, "They've been watching us since the beginning." Emeka said, "Not watching, waiting." She looked at him. He said, "We were nothing then, not worth the effort. But they saw what you were building, and they decided to wait until it was worth taking." She said, 30 years is a long time to wait." He said, "Not for men who believe patience is a strategy." She understood then, fully, completely, in the way that understanding arrives when all the pieces have been present for a long time, and only the final alignment was missing, what had been done to her, and how long it had been in preparation. And she understood something else, something that arrived not as anger but as a cold, clarifying calm. They had waited 30 years. And so had she. Not intentionally, not with a plan. But she had built something in those 30 years that the people trying to take it had never once accounted for, because they had never once looked at it directly. They had looked at the shares, they had looked at the contracts, they had looked at the board composition and the revenue figures and the asset portfolio. They had never looked at the 5 people she had trusted with the company's truth for 3 decades. That was their mistake, and it was not recoverable. She said, "What do we need?" Biodun said, "An emergency general meeting of shareholders. 21 days notice required by the articles. But there's a provision for 14 days if the chair deems it urgent." She said, "I deem it urgent." Biodun almost smiled. He said, "Then we have 14 days." She said, "What are we presenting?" He opened the leather case again. He removed a second set of documents, thicker, organized with tabs, the kind of preparation that does not happen in 6 months of evenings without a great deal of sacrifice of other things. He said, "Evidence of coordinated share acquisition designed to circumvent disclosure thresholds. Evidence of a related party conflict of interest on the board. Evidence of deliberate below-cost competitive pricing intended to damage the company's performance metrics." and a full audit of the Northern Corridor pricing review showing that the 15% reduction recommendation was based on manipulated cost data. He placed it on the table. He said, "None of this is circumstantial." She looked at the stack of documents. She said, "Bio done. How long have you been working on this?" He said, 11 months. She said, "And you didn't tell me." He said, "We told each other. We weren't ready to tell you until we were certain. You taught us that." She looked at him. He said, "You used to say, in the early years, when someone came to you with a problem, don't bring me a problem unless you've spent 20 minutes trying to solve it yourself first." He paused. "We spent 11 months. She put her hand flat on the stack of documents. She did not speak for a moment. The chandelier above them burned with the same steady warmth it always burned with. The city moved below. The clock on the wall measured seconds that now felt different from the seconds before. Heavier, more deliberate, full of the specific weight of things that have been a long time coming. She said, "Call the lawyers." Emeka said, "Already called. They're waiting downstairs." She said, "The auditors?" Tunde said, "External auditors. Firm has no relationship with anyone on your current board. Engaged last week." She said, "The shareholding register?" Dio spoke. His voice was quiet enough that everyone leaned slightly toward it. He said, "I have been to every minority shareholder who holds more than 1%, individually, in person. I've spent 4 months doing it." He placed a folded list on the table. "These are the ones who will vote with you." He paused. "It's enough." Abost looked at the list. She counted. She looked up. She said, "This is 53%. Dio said, "With the 3% that Emeka holds personally." She looked at Emeka. He said, "I bought it 7 months ago, when Biodan first identified the share movement." He met her gaze steadily. 3% of a 30 billion naira company is not a small amount of money. She said, "Where did you—" He said, "I sold the Ikeja property, the one I bought in 2019. She was quiet. He said, "It wasn't a difficult decision." She looked at him for a long moment. At all 5 of them. At what they had spent in money, in time, in the 11 months of evenings and careful conversations and patient, methodical construction of a case that left no room for reasonable doubt. She thought about a compound in Mushin. She thought about a van that needed maintenance and a woman who had no money to pay for it and 5 young men who had said yes anyway. She said, "I never deserved you." Emeka said, "You hired us when no one else would." He said it simply, without sentiment, as a fact. "You paid us what you owed. You told us the truth when you could have managed what we knew. You brought us into rooms we were not supposed to be in." He looked at the table. "You treated us like our judgment was worth listening to, for 30 years. He looked up. "We're not here because we owe you. We're here because this is ours too." Nobody in the room spoke. The clock ticked, and somewhere below, in the lobby of a building that Abosede Adeyemi-Cole had purchased with money she had earned, without any of the advantages that people who had not earned money liked to believe were simply called talent, Rotimi and his lawyers were waiting for a meeting that was not going to go the way any of them had prepared for. The general meeting was called for a Thursday. The 14 days between the call and the meeting moved the way high-stakes time always moves. Slowly in the waiting, then suddenly. The legal team filed the disclosure violation notice with the Securities and Exchange Commission 3 days after the meeting was called. The filing was public, as all such filings were required to be. It appeared in the financial press on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, 2 of the 8 board members who had voted with Rotimi had called Abosede's office requesting urgent conversations. She did not return their calls. Not yet. Timing, she had learned a long time ago in a very different context, was its own kind of argument. The auditors worked quickly and without fanfare. They produced a report in 9 days. The report confirmed what Biodun's analysis had shown, that the Northern Corridor cost data had been submitted with figures that did not correspond to the actual operational records. The variance was not an error. Errors have a random distribution. These figures had been adjusted in one direction only, consistently, across 8 quarters, always in a way that made the division's performance appear worse than it was. The auditors used careful language, but careful language, when the facts beneath it are unambiguous, lands harder than dramatic language, because it cannot be accused of overstatement. Broadridge Transport Ventures ceased active operations on a Tuesday. No announcement. The company's accounts, when the Commission examined them, showed a pattern of funding that connected through 3 intermediary companies to a personal holding account registered to Emmanuel Okeke. The Commission's investigators were thorough. They were also interested in the father's company, the development firm from Mushin 30 years ago. Solar had filed that connection separately, in a supplementary note that he had attached to Biodun's main filing, with the quiet, methodical precision of a man who builds things carefully and does not leave loose edges. Rotimi arrived at the general meeting in a suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. He came with 2 lawyers and the particular posture of a man who has not yet understood that the room has already been decided. He sat on the left side of the table with his faction. He had 6 of the original 8 board members with him. The other 2 had sent written apologies and did not appear. Abosede arrived with her 5. They did not sit separately. They arranged themselves around her. Emeka on her right, Biodun beside him with the documents, Tunde and Sola across from them, Dayo at the far end where he could see the whole room. The shareholders' representatives filled the remaining seats. Lawyers lined the walls. A commission observer sat at the back with a notebook. The chair of the meeting, an independent director who had been on the board since before Rotimi's appointment, opened proceedings. He was 63, a man who had chaired enough meetings to recognize immediately which side of a table held the weight. He read the agenda without expression. Rotimi spoke first. He was smooth. He was prepared. He made the case for management transition with the polished confidence of someone who has rehearsed a version of reality until it feels true. He cited performance figures. He cited the Northern Corridor decline. He cited the need for fresh leadership in a changing market. He did not mention Broadridge. He did not mention Emmanuel Okeke. He spoke for 11 minutes, and every word of it was technically accurate and structurally false in the specific way of arguments that select their evidence before they select their conclusion. When he finished, he looked at Abosede. She said nothing. She nodded at Biodun. Biodun stood. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He placed 3 documents before the chair. He said, "I would like to table the external audit report, the commission disclosure filing, and a supplementary note regarding related historical transactions." He said it the way he said everything, with the calm precision of someone for whom the facts were sufficient and the presentation of them needed no drama. Rotimi's lead lawyer said, "I object to the introduction of documents not included in the advance agenda." The chair looked at the lawyer. He said, "The documents were filed with the Commission 4 days ago and are a matter of public record. They are relevant to the agenda item under discussion. Objection noted and overruled." Rotimi's face did not change, but his hands did. They moved slightly, a small involuntary adjustment. The hands of a man whose body has understood something his face has not yet agreed to show. The chair read the audit summary aloud. He read it slowly, in the specific cadence of a man who wants every word to have the space it requires. When he reached the section about the adjusted cost figures, someone on Rotimi's side of the table cleared their throat. When he reached the section about the directional consistency of the adjustments, 2 of the shareholders' representatives leaned toward each other and spoke in whispers too low to hear. When he reached the commission filing and the connection to Broadridge, Rotimi's second lawyer placed a hand on Rotimi's arm. Rotimi removed the hand. He said, "These allegations are—" Abosede said, "They are not allegations." Her voice was quiet. The room went quieter. She said, "An allegation is an assertion without evidence. These are findings, made by an independent firm with no relationship to this company or any person in this room, supported by commission filings, corroborated by 11 months of financial analysis conducted by someone who has managed the accounts of this company honestly for 30 years. She looked at Rotimi. "You can challenge the conclusions if you have evidence to the contrary." She paused. "Do you have evidence to the contrary?" He said nothing. She said, "Emmanuel Okeke has resigned from the board, as of this morning. His resignation letter cites personal reasons." She let that sit for a moment. It does not cite personal reasons. The room was very still. She said, "I have been building this company for 31 years. I built it without connections, without inherited capital, without any of the advantages that certain people in this room have spent their careers treating as natural rather than given. I built it by finding people who were good at their work and treating their judgment as worth something and paying what I owed on time." She looked around the room. "Every person who works in this company, from the drivers to the workshop floor to the accounts department to the corridor outside this room, is owed the truth about what has been attempted here. And this room is going to hear it." Biodan placed the supplementary note before the chair. He said, "In 1994, a development company acquired land in Mushin, Lagos, through a transaction that involved forged documents and the forced displacement of a legitimate mechanic compound operating on that land. The compound housed 5 workers who were given 30 days to vacate. The development company's chairman was the father of Emmanuel Okeke, who was appointed to this board 14 months ago at the recommendation of Rotimi Adeyemi-Cole." He paused. "Those 5 workers are in this room." He sat down. The room did not explode. It did not erupt. What happened was something quieter and more absolute, a shift in pressure, a change in the quality of the air, the specific atmosphere of a space in which something has just become permanent. Someone dropped a pen. The sound of it hitting the table was very loud. Rotimi looked at the 5 men around Abosede. For the first time since he had walked into the room, he looked at them as though he were seeing them. Not as mechanics, not as employees, not as the kind of peripheral figures that powerful families learn to look past, because looking past them is a habit that wealth teaches early and reinforces constantly. He looked at them as what they were, men who had built something quietly over 30 years, in the spaces that power does not bother to watch, because it does not believe those spaces matter. He said, "This is not—" Emeka said, "Sit down." It was 2 words, no volume, no anger, no drama. Just the specific, absolute authority of a man who has spent 30 years being underestimated and has run completely out of patience for it. Rotimi sat down. The vote was taken. The shareholder resolution to initiate management transition failed. 53% against, 3% abstaining, 44% in favor, reduced from the original 46 by 2 shareholders who had revised their position after reviewing the audit findings that morning. The chair recorded the vote. He noted the commission observation. He noted the audit findings as referred to the board's governance committee for further action. He closed the meeting. Rotimi stood. His lawyers were already gathering papers with the concentrated urgency of people managing an exit. He looked at Abosede. He said, "You think this is finished?" She said, "I think it's beginning." He left. His lawyers followed. The door closed. In the room that remained, her room, still her room, always her room, Abosede sat at the head of the table, and the 5 men sat around her, and nobody spoke for a moment that lasted exactly long enough. Bayodun began organizing his documents. Tunde leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Sola folded his hands on the table with the satisfaction of someone who has built something and watched it hold. Dio looked at the window. Emeka looked at Abosede. He said, "It's not over." She said, "No. Commission investigation will take months. Civil proceedings will take longer. Rotimi's family has resources." He said, "Do you have what you need to fight it?" She said, "We have what we built." She looked at him. "That's enough." He nodded once. Outside the window, Lagos did what Lagos always did. It moved. It was always moving, this city, always in the middle of something, always generating heat and noise, and the particular indestructible energy of a place that does not believe in pausing. Below, somewhere, a fleet of vehicles with the Adeyemi-Cole logo on their sides was moving through traffic, carrying cargo on schedules that had been planned and executed and maintained by people who showed up every day and did the work. That was the company. Not the shares, not the boardroom, not the chandelier, the work. The daily, unglamorous, precise work of people who had decided that what they built was worth the effort of building it correctly. She thought about a van on a dirt road outside Ibadan. She thought about 5 young men in a compound who had said yes to a woman with no money and nothing to offer except the truth of what she was trying to do. She thought about 31 years of mornings, the early ones when she had not been certain the company would survive the month, the later ones when she had been certain, and that certainty had felt like something she had not quite earned yet, and the most recent ones, the ones for the last 18 months, when something had felt wrong in a way she could not name and had not named, because naming it would have required acting on it, and she had not yet understood what acting on it required. It had required this. It had required 5 men who had spent 11 months of evenings building a case in their own time for a company they did not own on paper, because they understood, without discussing it, that ownership is not always the thing on the document, and the thing on the document is not always the thing that matters. 2 years later, the commission concluded its investigation. Emmanuel Okiki was formally charged with securities fraud and undisclosed related party transactions. His father's company, the development firm that had displaced the Mushin compound 30 years ago, was found to have operated a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition across 3 states spanning 15 years. 7 other families received compensation through a civil restitution process that Dio managed personally, with the same meticulous insistence on names and individual acknowledgement that he had always applied to everything that mattered. He insisted that each family receive a letter, not a form letter, a letter that named them specifically, that acknowledged what had been taken from them specifically, and that confirmed what was being returned. Rotimi did not face criminal charges. The evidence tied him to strategy, but not to execution. What he faced instead was something his family had never prepared him for: irrelevance. The shareholder petition collapsed. 2 of his closest allies on the board resigned in the months following the general meeting. His professional credibility in the Lagos business community, which he had spent a decade carefully constructing, dissolved with the specific, quiet speed of things that were built on other people's foundations. He moved to London. Nobody followed. The company grew. It grew not because of the shareholder victory. That was a defense, not an advance. It grew because of what the 5 had built during the 11 months they had spent on the case, while simultaneously continuing the work. Tunde had trained 12 new mechanics, using a curriculum he had spent 2 years developing, formalizing 30 years of knowledge that had previously existed only in hands and habit, and the specific memory of people who had learned by doing. Sola had designed a fleet maintenance system that reduced downtime across the entire operation by 22% in the first year it was fully implemented. Bayodun had developed a financial monitoring framework that flagged anomalies of the kind that had been used against the company, and had implemented it quietly across the accounts before anyone knew what it was for. Dio had rebuilt relationships with 11 clients in the Northern Corridor that had been lost to Broadridge's predatory pricing, visiting each one personally, listening, understanding what had gone wrong from their perspective, and proposing solutions that addressed what they actually needed rather than what a contract template assumed they needed. Emeka had done something else. He had written a document, not a legal document, not a business plan. A document that described in plain language how the company had actually functioned for 30 years, the real operating principles, the knowledge that existed between people rather than in systems, the decisions that had been made and why, the things that had been tried and failed, and the things that had worked and why they had worked. He had written it over 6 months in the evenings, in the same careful and deliberate way he had spent his whole life doing things. He had given it to Abosede without explanation. She had read it in one sitting. She had called him afterward. She had said, "This is the company's most important document." He had said, "I know. I should have written it 20 years ago." She had said, "Why didn't you?" He had said, "I didn't think anyone would want it." She had said, "I want it." He had said, "You have it." On the 31st anniversary of the company's founding, Abosede held a gathering. Not a gala, not an awards ceremony. A gathering in the warehouse in Ikeja that had been the first hub, now renovated but still recognizable to anyone who had worked in it in the early years, which was most of the people who came. She invited the drivers, the mechanics, the account staff, the operations people who had spent 3 decades making schedules, work that had no right to work. She invited the clients who had been with the company since the beginning. She invited the families of people who had worked there and died, because a 31-year company carries its dead with it, and they deserved to be in the room. She invited the 5. She did not make a long speech. She had never been a woman who believed that the length of a speech corresponded to the depth of what she felt. She said what needed to be said, and she said it clearly and without decoration. She spoke about what she had built, and how she had built it, and who she had built it with. She named every person she could name. When she named the 5, she did not describe them as mechanics. She did not describe them as employees. She described them as what they were. The people who had made the company real when it was still an idea, who had held the truth of it during the years when it was under pressure, who had spent 30 years being the foundation that everyone else stood on without ever once requiring that foundation to be acknowledged before they would keep holding it up. She said, "I owe them more than this room can hold. But I will spend the rest of this company's life trying to be worth the trust they gave me on a Tuesday morning in Mushin when they had every reason to say no, and said yes instead." Emeka, seated in the front row, looked at his hands. They were the same hands they had always been. If you have ever been told that you are not worth the room you are standing in, if you have ever done work that mattered and watched someone else receive the credit, if you have ever stayed when leaving would have been easier and been patient when patience cost more than you had, this story is yours. Subscribe to Tales of Tears African and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the world is not only made by people who are given what they have. It is also made, quietly, steadily, over 30 years, in compounds and warehouses and boardrooms where they were never supposed to arrive, by people who built what they were never supposed to build. Leave a comment. Tell us the moment in this story that made you feel something true. We will be here. We always are. With the next one, which begins, as all the best ones do, with someone being told they are not enough, for the very last time.